In 1995, Maplin was the most trusted name on the British High Street. Not for fashion, not for food, but for something far more important. If you wanted to understand how something worked, you went to Maplin. If something broke, you went to Maplin. If you had an idea, just an idea, half-formed, scribbled on the back of an envelope, you went to Maplin, and someone there would help you build it. 220 stores, every major town, every retail park from Aberdeen to Plymouth. Staff who could look at a circuit diagram and tell you exactly which component you needed and why. Then on the 1st of February of 2018, it was over. No rescue deal. No buyer. 2,500 people arrived for work that Monday morning and found a notice on the door and a phone number for the administrators. By the end of March, every single Maplin in Britain was dark. How does a shop that spent 46 years teaching Britain how to build things, how to think, how to fix, how to make, simply vanish? And what exactly did we lose when the lights went out for the last time? This is that story. The story begins not in a gleaming shopping center, not in a boardroom, but in a small terraced house in Westcliff-on-Sea, Essex, in 1972. Two brothers, Roger and Cliff Stanford, had a problem that thousands of electronics hobbyists across Britain shared, but nobody had properly solved. If you wanted to build a radio receiver, repair a valve amplifier, or assemble your own audio equipment from scratch, you had two options. You could order components by post from a mail order catalog and wait weeks for delivery. Or you could drive to one of the handful of specialist shops scattered across the country, hope they had what you needed, and hope even more that the man behind the counter knew what he was talking about. Most of the time, neither option was good enough. Roger and Cliff believed there was a better way. They launched Maplin Electronic Supplies as a mail-order business, a catalog operation sending components directly to hobbyists who knew exactly what they wanted but had nowhere reliable to buy it. The name came simply from Maplin Sands, a stretch of tidal mudflat off the Essex coast. Unglamorous, perhaps, but grounded, solid, quietly, stubbornly English. The catalog itself was something remarkable. It was not a glossy marketing document. It was dense, technical, and honest. Pages of resistors, capacitors, transformers, and transistors listed with specifications and prices, written for people who understood what they were reading. It assumed intelligence. It respected the customer. In an era when most retailers talked down to the public, Maplin spoke to its audience as equals. The first customers were radio amateurs, electronics teachers, engineers who tinkered at weekends, and teenagers who had taken apart the family television and were determined to understand every component inside it. Britain in the early 1970s had a deep and serious culture of home electronics. Fed by the BBC, by schools that still taught practical skills, by a generation of men who had learned electronics during national service and never lost the habit. Maplin did not create that culture, but it gave that culture a home. By the mid-1970s, the mail-order business was growing steadily. Orders came in from every corner of the country. The catalog expanded, the range deepened, and then came the decision that would transform Maplin from a postal service into something far more significant. In 1976, the first Maplin retail store opened in Rayleigh, Essex. It was modest, a compact shop front, functional shelving, no theatrical lighting or elaborate displays. But the moment customers walked through the door, something shifted. Here were the components from the catalog, real and tangible, held in small compartmented drawers and clearly labeled bins. Here were staff who had been chosen not for their ability to upsell extended warranties, but for their genuine knowledge of electronics. A customer could walk in with a half-finished project, describe the problem, and leave 20 minutes later with exactly the right part and a clear understanding of why it was the right part. That experience, practical, respectful, unhurried, became the foundation of everything Maplin would build over the next 4 decades. Roger Stanford would later reflect that what they were really selling was not components at all. They were selling confidence. The confidence to try something difficult. The confidence to take something apart and believe you could put it back together. In a country that had spent a century building things, ships, engines, radar systems, the infrastructure of an empire, that was not a small thing to offer. It was, in fact, exactly what Britain needed. By the late 1970s, something extraordinary was happening in living rooms, garages, and garden sheds across Britain. People were building things not professionally, not for money, for the pure, consuming satisfaction of understanding how the world worked, improving it by making something function with their own hands. A shortwave radio receiver assembled on a Sunday afternoon, a burglar alarm wired through the loft of a semi-detached in Coventry, a bass amplifier built from scratch in a Leeds bedroom by a 17-year-old who couldn't afford to buy one. These were not exceptional people. They were ordinary British men and women who believed, with quiet certainty, that if you had the right components, the right instructions, and the right place to ask for help, there was nothing you couldn't figure out. Maplin was that place. Through the late 1970s and into the 1980s, the store count grew steadily. Manchester, Birmingham, Bristol, Glasgow, Newcastle. Each new location followed the same model: compact, knowledgeable, unhurried. The shelving was functional rather than decorative. The lighting was bright and practical. There were no lifestyle displays, no mood boards, no carefully curated brand experiences. There were drawers, hundreds of them, each one labeled with a component reference number, each one containing exactly what it said it contained. For a certain kind of person, walking into Maplin felt like walking into a library where every book was one you actually wanted to read. The staff were the heart of it. Maplin did not hire generalists and train them to smile. It hired people who genuinely understood electronics. Former engineers, dedicated hobbyists, men who spent their weekends doing exactly what their customers were trying to do. A customer could arrive with nothing more than a vague description of a problem. There's a hum in my amplifier that wasn't there before. And leave with a diagnosis, a solution, in a small paper bag of components that cost less than £1. That kind of knowledge, freely given, built a loyalty that no loyalty card scheme could ever replicate. Then in 1981, everything accelerated. The BBC Micro arrived. A year later, the Sinclair ZX Spectrum. Britain did not merely adopt the home computer, it embraced it with an intensity that surprised the rest of the world. Within 3 years, more households in the United Kingdom owned a home computer than anywhere else in Europe. And with that wave of ownership came an immediate, urgent, practical question. What do you do when it breaks? You went to Maplin. Replacement keyboards for the Spectrum, interface cables for the BBC Micro, joystick connectors, power supply components, audio leads, monitor adapters. Maplin stocked all of it. And crucially, the staff understood all of it. At a moment when the rest of the retail world was still trying to work out what a home computer actually was, Maplin already knew. It had always known. It had been preparing for this moment for a decade. The 1980s became the defining era. Maplin expanded through the high streets and retail parks of Britain with quiet confidence. The catalog, by now a substantial publication running to hundreds of pages, was something that serious hobbyists kept on their workbench alongside their soldering irons. It arrived through the letterbox with the weight and density of a technical manual because that is essentially what it was. Pages of components organized by category, each listing accompanied by a clear specification. No hyperbole, no lifestyle photography, just honest information for people who knew how to use it. Families built rituals around it. A Saturday morning trip to Maplin was not a chore. It was an expedition. Fathers brought sons. Grandfathers brought grandsons. The conversation in the car on the way, there was about the project. What it needed, what might work, what had failed the previous weekend, and why. Inside the store, those conversations continued, sometimes with a staff member who had a better idea, sometimes with a complete stranger in the components aisle who happened to have solved the same problem 6 months earlier. What was it about that place, those fluorescent lights, those labeled drawers, that faint smell of solder flux and new plastic, that made a generation of British engineers feel for the first time that they genuinely belong somewhere? The answer is simpler than it might seem. Maplin told the truth. It did not pretend that electronics was easy. It did not simplify, sanitize, or condescend. It assumed that the person standing in front of the counter was capable of understanding a real explanation, and it gave them one. In a retail landscape that increasingly treated customers as passive consumers to be managed, Maplin treated its customers as active makers to be equipped. By the early 1990s, Maplin had become something that very few British retailers ever achieve. It had become genuinely irreplaceable. Not because there was no competition, there was in smaller specialist shops and mail-order rivals, but because nothing else combined the range, the expertise, the physical presence, and the atmosphere in quite the same way. You could find individual components elsewhere. You could not find Maplin elsewhere. The brand had woven itself into the fabric of British technical culture with a quietness that belied its importance. It was not glamorous. It was not fashionable. It did not advertise on television or sponsor football teams. It simply showed up every Saturday morning in every major town in Britain, ready to help whoever came through the door with whatever they were trying to build. For a quarter of a century, that was enough. But the world outside was beginning to change in ways that even Maplin's most loyal customers had not yet noticed. And the company itself was about to face decisions that would test everything it had spent 20 years building. By 1993, Maplin faced a choice that every successful British retailer eventually confronts. Stay small, stay specialist, stay exactly what you are, and risk being slowly overtaken by a world that is moving faster than you. Or grow, open more stores, reach more customers, build something that cannot be ignored. Maplin chose to grow. It was not an unreasonable decision. The logic was straightforward and, on paper, compelling. Britain's retail parks were expanding. New sites were opening across the country. Large format stores with generous floor space and ample car parking, positioned to serve the suburban households that were increasingly doing their shopping by car rather than on the high street. For a brand that had built its reputation on range and expertise, more space meant more stock. More stock meant more customers. More customers meant more revenue to reinvest in the depth of knowledge and service that had made Maplin what it was. The problem was that growth of this kind does not simply add to what already exists, it changes it. The original Maplin stores had been compact by necessity. A limited floor space meant a ruthlessly curated range. Every component stocked had to earn its place. Staff numbers were small, which meant every member of staff had to know the entire range well enough to advise on any of it. The intimacy of those early stores was not a design choice. It was a consequence of constraint, and constraint, it turned out, had been quietly protecting everything that made Maplin worth visiting. Larger stores needed to be filled. A retail unit of 3,000 or 4,000 square feet, positioned on a retail park alongside Currys and Argos, could not sustain itself on resistors and capacitors alone. The economics were simple and unforgiving. To justify the rent, Maplin needed to sell higher value items alongside the components that had always been its core. And so gradually the range began to shift. CCTV cameras, portable audio equipment, computer accessories, cables and connectors for the consumer electronics market, GPS devices, digital radios, remote-controlled toys. Each edition was individually defensible. These were, after all, products that Maplin's technically minded customers might genuinely need. The staff could explain them. The brand's reputation for expertise would carry across. And the margins on consumer electronics were considerably better than the margins on a bag of 10-pence resistors. What nobody said aloud, or perhaps nobody yet understood clearly enough to say, was that every meter of shelf space given to consumer electronics was a meter taken from the components, the kits, the specialist equipment that no other retailer on the high street could match. Maplin's competitive advantage had never been in selling things that other shops also sold. It had been in selling things that other shops could not or would not bother with. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, that advantage was being diluted. The franchise model added further complexity. As Maplin expanded through the 1990s and into the 2000s, not all locations were company-owned. Franchise operators took on individual stores, investing their own capital in exchange for the right to trade under the Maplin name. These were, for the most part, people who genuinely believed in what Maplin represented. Former engineers, dedicated enthusiasts, individuals who had spent years as customers before becoming owners. They had bought into the brand precisely because of what it stood for. But franchise relationships carry their own tensions. A corporate center focused on national growth and margin improvement does not always align with a franchise owner focused on serving a specific local community in the way that community expects to be served. Decisions made in head office about range, about pricing, about store layout arrived at franchise level as directives to be implemented, not conversations to be had. The people closest to the customers, who understood best what those customers actually needed, had the least influence over the decisions that shaped their experience. By the early 2000s, Maplin had grown to over 200 stores. By any conventional measure of retail success, this was an achievement. The brand was nationally recognized. The catalog remained an institution. The staff at their best were still the most knowledgeable in the industry. But something had shifted, not dramatically, not in any way that a casual customer, walking into a Maplin for the first time, would have noticed. The shelves were still full. The staff were still helpful. The component drawers were still there, still labeled, still containing exactly what they said they contained. It was the long-standing customers who noticed, the men who had been coming in since the 1970s, the engineers who remembered the original stores in Raleigh and Bournemouth. They could not always articulate precisely what had changed, but they felt it. A slight thinning of the specialist range, a gradual increase in the proportion of floor space given to products you could also find in half a dozen other shops. A new member of staff who was helpful and pleasant, but who, when the question became genuinely technical, needed to look it up rather than simply knowing. It was not a crisis, not yet, but the seeds of something harder to recover from had already been planted. And in the boardrooms of private equity firms across the City of London, a very different kind of interest in Maplin was beginning to take shape. There is a particular kind of Saturday morning that anyone who grew up in Britain between 1980 and 2005 will recognize immediately. The car is cold. The radio is on. There is a list, not a shopping list in the conventional sense, but a project list. A set of components needed for something half-finished on the workbench at home, or something entirely new that has been turning over in the mind all week. The destination is already decided. It was always going to be Maplin. By the mid-1990s, Maplin had achieved something that most British retailers spend their entire existence chasing and never quite reach. It had become part of the rhythm of ordinary life. Not for everyone. Maplin was never a mass-market brand in the way that Marks and Spencer or Boots was a mass-market brand. But for its audience, it occupied a place that was entirely its own, a place of quiet authority, a place that knew what it was, knew who it served, and delivered on that knowledge with a consistency that its customers had come to rely on absolutely. The catalog remained the emotional center of the brand. By the 1990s, it ran to several hundred pages, a dense, honest, technically rigorous document that arrived through the letterbox 2 or 3 times a year and was treated in many households less like a retail catalog and more like a reference work. Hobbyists kept back issues. Engineers annotated pages. Teenagers dog-eared the sections on audio kits and radio receivers. The catalog was not merely a list of products available for purchase. It was evidence that a serious world existed. A world where making things mattered, where technical knowledge was valued, where the question of how something worked was always worth asking. The stores themselves had become landmarks, not in the architectural sense. Maplin never built anything that would trouble a heritage listing, but in the sense that mattered more to their customers. They were fixed points, reliable, unchanged in their essential character, even as the retail parks around them turned over their tenants with increasing frequency. The Maplin in your town was the same as the Maplin in every other town, and that sameness was not a weakness, but a comfort. You knew what you would find. You knew the staff would be able to help. You knew you would leave with exactly what you came for, and probably a few things you hadn't known you needed until someone behind the counter mentioned them. Generational transmission happened quietly and without ceremony. A grandfather who had built crystal radio sets in the 1950s brought his son to Maplin in the 1980s. That son brought his own children in the 1990s. Those children, now adults, would later describe walking into Maplin as one of their clearest sense memories. The brightness of the lighting, the particular smell of the components aisle, the sound of the drawers being pulled open and pushed shut. These were not the grand sensory experiences of Christmas or childhood holidays. They were ordinary Saturdays. But ordinary Saturdays, repeated across 20 or 30 years, become something more than the sum of their parts. They become a kind of home. When was the last time a shop made you feel that the thing you cared about, the obscure, technical, slightly eccentric thing that not everyone understood, was not merely tolerated but actively celebrated? For the community that Maplin served, the answer to that question was always the same. Maplin made them feel that way every time they walked through the door. The cultural footprint extended beyond the stores themselves. Maplin supplied components to school technology departments across the country at a time when practical electronics was still part of the curriculum. It sponsored electronics clubs and amateur radio societies. Its catalog was recommended reading in technical colleges. When Tomorrow's World demonstrated a new piece of technology on BBC One, and 1 million viewers immediately wanted to understand how it worked, Maplin was ready for the phone calls and the footfall the following week. By the late 1990s, the internet was beginning to change British retail in ways that most high street businesses were only dimly aware of. Maplin, by contrast, launched its online catalog early and with genuine commitment, a logical extension for a brand that had always operated by mail order and understood the value of reaching customers who were not near a physical store. For a brief and optimistic period, it seemed possible that Maplin might navigate the digital transition better than most of its high street contemporaries. It already had the catalog infrastructure. It already had the customer relationship. It already had the trust. The stores continued to grow. The brand continued to strengthen. In towns and cities across Britain, Maplin remained what it had always been, the place where serious people went to do serious things. What nobody could see clearly enough, in those years of steady growth and quiet confidence, was that the retail landscape was not simply changing around Maplin. It was being rebuilt from the foundations upward, and the new foundations left very little room for a shop whose greatest strength had always been the knowledge of the person standing behind the counter. The cracks, when they came, would not arrive with any announcement. They never do. In 1998, Amazon opened its United Kingdom operation. It did not arrive with fanfare. It did not, in its earliest months, look like an existential threat to anything. It was a website that sold books, then music, then DVDs. The prices were reasonable. The delivery was reliable. And the range, even in those early years, was wider than anything a physical shop could stock on a finite number of shelves. Most British retailers looked at Amazon in 1998 and saw a novelty. An interesting development, perhaps. Something to monitor. Nothing that required an immediate response. Maplin looked at Amazon in 1998 and should have seen a mirror, because Amazon was not, at its core, a shop. It was a catalog, an infinitely deep, permanently available, instantly searchable catalog that could be accessed from anywhere in the country without a car journey, a car park, or a conversation with a member of staff. It was, in other words, exactly what Maplin had been since 1972. Except that it existed online. It was open every hour of every day, and it was about to expand its range to include every product category that existed. Maplin had built its entire business on the principle that customers needed access to a deep, specialist range and the knowledge to navigate it. Amazon was about to offer the range without the knowledge and charge less for it. The response from Maplin's management was not, in fairness, one of complete inaction. The online catalog was maintained and expanded. The website improved. Efforts were made to translate the in-store expertise into digital form. Product guides, how-to articles, technical specifications written for a knowledgeable audience. These were not trivial investments. They reflected a genuine understanding that the business needed to evolve. But they were not enough. And the reason they were not enough was not primarily strategic. It was structural. Maplin's stores were expensive to run. 220 locations across Britain, the majority of them in retail parks and shopping centers, each carrying a lease, a rates bill, a staffing cost, and an energy bill that bore no relationship to the margins available on a bag of resistors or a reel of solder. The economics of specialist components, low price points, modest volumes, high expertise requirements, had always been challenging. In the original small format stores of the 1970s and 1980s, those economics had worked because the overheads were modest and the range was tightly curated. In the large format stores of the 2000s, they worked considerably less well. The response, as it had been through the 1990s, was to sell more consumer electronics, more products with higher price points and better margins, more items that competed directly with Currys, Argos, and increasingly with Amazon itself. What did it mean for a shop whose entire identity rested on specialist knowledge to start competing on price and range with retailers who had no specialist knowledge at all, but had vastly more buying power, vastly more shelf space, and vastly more marketing budget? It meant slowly and then, with increasing speed, that Maplin's identity began to blur. The components were still there. The specialist staff were still there, or many of them were. But the floor space given to consumer electronics grew. The proportion of revenue coming from specialist components shrank. New hires, trained to sell gadgets and cables rather than to diagnose circuit problems, gradually changed the character of the shop floor. A customer arriving with a technical question in 2006 might find exactly the kind of knowledgeable assistance that had defined Maplin for 3 decades. Or they might find a pleasant young member of staff who understood the consumer electronics range perfectly well, but had no idea what a decoupling capacitor was or why it mattered. The long-standing customers noticed. They always notice, long before management does. Forum posts from the mid-2000s, on electronics hobbyist sites, on amateur radio boards, on the early technology discussion communities that would later become Reddit, record the shift with a precision that no internal management report could match. The range is thinning. The staff don't know the products the way they used to. The components aisle has shrunk again. There used to be 3 members of staff who could help with a specific query. Now there's 1, if you're lucky, and he's only in on Saturdays. These were not the complaints of people who wanted to be disappointed. They were the complaints of people who loved the place and could see from the inside that something was being lost. How long could a brand survive on loyalty earned over 30 years while quietly dismantling the reasons that loyalty had been given in the first place? The answer, it would turn out, was longer than it deserved to, but not as long as its customers hoped. In 2014, Maplin was acquired by Rutland Partners, a British private equity firm. The purchase price was reported at around £85 million. To Rutland Partners, Maplin was a retail asset with a strong brand, a national store network, and considerable potential for operational improvement and growth. To the men and women who had spent 30 years building it, and to the customers who had spent 30 years depending on it, Maplin was something else entirely. That distinction would prove fatal. Rutland Partners did not buy Maplin because they loved electronics. They bought it because the numbers, viewed from a certain angle, told an interesting story: a nationally recognized brand, a loyal customer base, 220 stores generating consistent revenue, a catalog operation with genuine digital potential. On paper, Maplin looked like a business that had underperformed its potential, a solid asset that, with the right financial engineering and operational discipline, could be made to work considerably harder. This is the language of private equity. It is not, in itself, dishonest language. Private equity investment has rescued genuinely failing businesses, created genuine value, and saved genuine jobs. The framework is not inherently predatory, but it carries within it a set of assumptions about what a business is and what it is for. Assumptions that, when applied to a business like Maplin, would prove catastrophically misaligned with reality. The first assumption is that a brand is an asset that can be separated from the operational culture that created it. Maplin's name, its reputation, its customer loyalty, these were real and valuable, but they had not been built by marketing campaigns or brand strategy exercises. They had been built over 40 years by the quality of the knowledge available on the shop floor. Strip away or dilute that knowledge and the brand does not retain its value. It decays, slowly at first, then faster. The second assumption is that cost reduction and revenue growth are compatible objectives when pursued simultaneously. Cut costs aggressively, reduce staff levels, lower the expertise threshold for new hires, rationalize the specialist range, and short-term margins improve. But the customers who notice the change are precisely the customers whose loyalty was most durable and most valuable. Lose them, and you have improved the margins on a business that is quietly hollowing out. Rutland Partners moved quickly. Debt was loaded onto the business, a standard private equity mechanism that transfers capital out of the acquired company while leaving the company itself responsible for servicing the borrowing. Sale-leaseback arrangements were pursued on store properties, generating immediate capital at the cost of ongoing rental obligations. These were not unusual moves. They were in the private equity playbook, entirely conventional. What they were not was compatible with the long-term health of a specialist retailer whose competitive advantage depended on sustained investment in people, range, and customer experience. The staff felt it first. A long-serving manager at a Midland store, someone who had been with Maplin since the early 1990s, who had trained dozens of younger colleagues, who could diagnose an audio fault from a customer's description alone, described the period after the Rutland acquisition as one of progressive demoralization. Targets changed. The metrics that mattered shifted from customer satisfaction and specialist knowledge retention to footfall conversion and average transaction value. Training budgets were reduced. Experienced staff who left were replaced, when they were replaced at all, with generalist retail workers paid at a lower rate. Nobody announced that Maplin was no longer a specialist retailer. Nobody stood up in a staff meeting and said that the decades of accumulated expertise on the shop floor were no longer a priority. It happened through 100 smaller decisions, none of which, taken individually, seemed decisive. A training day canceled here. A specialist hire not made there. A components range quietly reduced to free up shelf space for higher margin consumer electronics. A performance review framework that rewarded sales volume and penalized time spent with customers who needed genuine technical advice. Then came Brexit. The referendum result of June 2016 did not immediately destroy Maplin, but it set in motion a sequence of events that a business carrying significant debt and thinning margins was structurally unable to survive. The pound fell sharply in the weeks following the vote and did not recover. For a retailer sourcing the majority of its products from Asia, as every consumer electronics retailer in Britain did, this was not a manageable inconvenience. It was a fundamental change to the cost base. Products that had been priced and margined under the assumption of a stable exchange rate were now arriving at a significantly higher cost. Those costs could be absorbed, passed on to customers, or hedged. But for a business already carrying the debt burden that Rutland Partners had loaded onto it, the room to absorb was limited, the appetite of customers for higher prices was constrained, and the mechanisms for hedging were expensive. Maplin attempted to refinance its debt in late 2017. The attempt failed. The reasons were not complicated. The lenders who might have provided new financing looked at the business and saw what the balance sheet showed: a retailer with significant debt obligations, declining like-for-like sales, compressed margins, and a market position that was being eroded from multiple directions simultaneously. Amazon was taking the online components business. Currys and Argos were taking the consumer electronics business. The specialist hobbyist market, Maplin's original constituency and still its most loyal, had partially migrated to online suppliers who could offer a deeper range at lower prices without the overhead of a physical store network. There was no rescue. In January 2018, Maplin's board appointed KPMG to explore options. The options were limited. A sale of the business as a going concern would have required a buyer willing to take on the debt, the lease obligations, and the challenge of rebuilding a specialist retail operation in a market that had fundamentally changed. No such buyer came forward. On the 1st of February 2018, Maplin entered administration. The people who bore the cost of these decisions were not the private equity partners who had acquired the business 4 years earlier and extracted their returns through the debt arrangements and asset transactions of the intervening period. They were the 2,500 men and women who worked in Maplin stores across Britain, the Saturday staff in Sheffield, the long-serving managers in Glasgow, the technical specialists in Bristol who had spent careers building exactly the kind of knowledge that the brand had always promised its customers. Many of them were not told directly. They arrived at work and found notices on the doors. They received text messages. They heard from colleagues before they heard from management. People who had given 10, 15, 20 years to a brand they genuinely believed in learned that it was over through a piece of paper on a glass door in a retail park on a Tuesday morning in February. Who was accountable for that? Who sat in a room and decided that a business built on trust, expertise, and 4 decades of genuine customer relationships could be loaded with debt, stripped of investment, and driven into the ground? And that this was an acceptable way to treat both the business and the people who had built it? The answer in the private equity model is that accountability is diffused by design. Decisions are made collectively, over time, by people who are no longer directly involved by the time the consequences arrive. The partners who structured the Rutland acquisition in 2014 were not present at the door of a Maplin store in February 2018. The debt that made refinancing impossible had been arranged years earlier by people operating entirely within the legal and financial norms of their industry. None of that made it easier to explain to a 53-year-old electronics specialist standing outside a locked store on a February morning why 20 years of expertise and loyalty had been worth precisely nothing in the final accounting. The 1st of February 2018 was a Thursday. It was an ordinary morning in every retail park in Britain. Gray skies, cold air, the particular flatness of a winter weekday when the car parks are half empty and the shops are quiet. In Maplin stores across the country, staff arrived for their shifts as they had done hundreds of times before. They unlocked the doors, turned on the lights, booted up the tills, and began the routine of a trading day. By mid-morning, the news was everywhere. Maplin Electronics had entered administration. KPMG had been appointed as administrators. The company had failed to secure the refinancing it needed to service its debt obligations. Trading would continue while a buyer was sought. But there was no buyer on the horizon, no rescue deal in negotiation, no white knight riding in from the City of London with a check and a turnaround plan. For the customers who read the news online that morning, the reaction was immediate and visceral. Forums that had been quietly discussing Maplin's declining range and changing character for years suddenly filled with something different. Not criticism, but grief. People who had not visited a Maplin in months or years felt the news as a personal loss. They wrote about the first time they had been taken there as children. They wrote about the project that Maplin had made possible, the repair that Maplin had enabled, the Saturday morning ritual that had structured decades of weekends. They wrote with the slightly embarrassed sincerity of people who had not expected to feel this strongly about a shop, that something real had gone. The staff experienced it differently. At a store in the north of England, a manager who had been with Maplin for 16 years described arriving that Thursday morning with no prior warning that the administration announcement was coming. She had opened the store as normal, dealt with the first customers of the day, and then received a call from a colleague at another branch who had seen the news on his phone. She spent the rest of that shift answering questions from customers she could not answer, fielding calls from staff she could not reassure, and managing a shop floor that was still technically open for business, while the business itself was collapsing around her. Nobody from head office called. At a store in the Southwest, a member of staff who had joined Maplin straight from college and spent 8 years working his way up to a senior technical role described the particular cruelty of the trading while in administration period. The stores remained open. Customers continued to come in. The shelves were still stocked. To anyone walking through the door, it looked like a functioning shop. But behind the counter, the staff knew. They knew the redundancy notices were coming. They knew the pension contributions had stopped. They knew that the administration process was not a rescue. It was an orderly wind down, dressed in the language of commercial possibility to maintain footfall while the administrators worked through the asset disposal. It lasted 7 weeks. Throughout February and into March, KPMG worked through the process of seeking a buyer for the business. Several parties expressed interest. None made an offer that covered the liabilities. The brand name attracted attention. Maplin remained, even in administration, one of the most recognized electronics retail brands in Britain. But a brand name without the store network, the staff, the supplier relationships, and the operational infrastructure that gave it meaning was not, in the end, worth what would have been required to acquire the whole. The liquidation sales began. There is a particular atmosphere in a shop that is dying. It is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. But it is unmistakable to anyone who has experienced it. And in the spring of 2018, hundreds of thousands of British customers experienced it in Maplin stores across the country. The shelves begin to thin. Products that have sold are not restocked. The carefully organized component drawers, which had for decades been maintained with a precision that reflected the seriousness with which Maplin took its specialist range, begin to show gaps. Labels remain on empty slots. The lighting seems somehow harsher when there is less on the shelves to absorb it. The staff are still there, still helpful, still doing their jobs with a professionalism that, under the circumstances, bordered on the extraordinary. But the conversations are different now, quieter, more careful. Customers came in those final weeks for reasons that were not entirely rational. Some came for the discounts, the liquidation pricing that made components and consumer electronics available at reductions that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. But many came for something harder to name. They came because they were not ready to stop coming, because walking into Maplin on a Saturday morning was something they had done for 30 years, and the knowledge that they would not be able to do it much longer made the doing of it feel urgent and necessary and sad. A man in his 60s, interviewed outside a closing Maplin store in the Midlands, described buying a set of component drawers from the shop fittings, the actual physical drawers, pulled from the shelving units that had held the resistors and capacitors and transistors he had been buying for 20 years. He had no particular use for them. He had enough storage at home, but he could not leave without taking something that proved the place had been real. The final stores closed in the last week of March 2018. There was no ceremony, no final day event, no gathering of long-serving staff or loyal customers to mark the occasion. Retail administrations do not end with dignity. They end with a last transaction, a till closed, a security shutter pulled down, and a set of keys handed to a landlord who already has plans for the space. The last Maplin store to close was in Staples Corner, North London. On the final day, a small number of customers lingered longer than their purchases required. Staff who had worked together for years said their goodbyes in a car park. The conversations were brief. There was not much to say that the situation had not already said for them. When the shutter came down for the last time, 46 years of British electronics retail came to an end in a retail park in North London on an ordinary afternoon without an audience. 2,500 people were out of work. Pension obligations that had been promised over decades were not met in full. Landlords across Britain began the process of finding new tenants for 220 empty units. The administrators filed their reports. The creditors received their allocations. The partners at Rutland returned to their offices. What did we lose when those shutters came down for the last time? Not just a shop, but everything a shop like that had always meant. The answer would take years to become fully clear, but it began to emerge almost immediately. In the forums and community boards and amateur radio clubs, where Maplin's customers tried, and largely failed, to find anything that could take its place. The name did not disappear entirely. Within months of the administration, the Maplin brand, the name, the website, the intellectual property, was acquired by Endless LLP, another British private equity firm. The logic was straightforward. Maplin remained one of the most recognized electronics retail brands in the country. The domain had traffic. The customer database had value. A lean online operation, carrying none of the overhead of a physical store network, could theoretically monetize that recognition at a fraction of the cost of running 220 shops. Maplin.co.uk returned. Products were listed. Orders could be placed. But it was not Maplin. Not in any sense that the people who had loved the original would have recognized. There were no staff who knew your name. There was no components aisle to browse on a Saturday morning. There was no conversation with someone who understood your project and could suggest a better approach. There was a website competently operated, selling electronics products that could also be found on Amazon, at Argos, and at a dozen other online retailers. The brand name sat on top of it like a label on the wrong jar, familiar, but fundamentally misleading about what was inside. The customers who had loved Maplin did not follow the brand to its online successor. They knew the difference. The 2,500 people who had worked in Maplin stores across Britain were left to find their own way forward. For the younger staff, the Saturday workers, the recent graduates in their first retail jobs, the redundancy was painful but navigable. The job market for retail workers, while not generous, was not closed. They moved on. For the long-serving specialists, the situation was considerably harder. A 50-year-old electronics expert who had spent 20 years building a career around genuine technical knowledge found that the retail market had very little use for that specific combination of skills. The shops that were hiring wanted generalists. The technical roles that matched their expertise existed in industries, engineering, manufacturing, electronics design, that did not necessarily recognize a retail career as relevant experience. Some found their footing. Many did not, at least not quickly, and not without a significant reduction in the seniority and satisfaction of what they did next. The pension shortfall was real, and for some of the longest-serving staff, it was the cruelest part of the ending. Contributions that had been promised, that had been part of the implicit contract between employer and employee over years and decades of service, were not fully honored. The legal mechanisms of administration are designed to manage exactly this kind of outcome, to distribute what remains as fairly as the circumstances allow. What they cannot do is make the circumstances fair. They were not fair. The high streets and retail parks where Maplin stores had stood did not remain empty for long. Commercial landlords do not allow vacancy to persist when tenants can be found. The spaces were filled with gym operators, with discount retailers, with food and beverage chains, with the endlessly proliferating categories of service business that had replaced product retail as the dominant occupier of British commercial property. In a few locations, the units were subdivided. In others, they were combined with adjacent spaces. In most, they became something that bore no relationship to what had been there before. The communities that had relied on Maplin as a practical resource, the electronics clubs, the school technology departments, the amateur radio societies, the maker spaces that had grown up in the 2010s and depended on accessible specialist supply, discovered the gap with a sharpness that surprised even those who had seen the closure coming. Online alternatives existed. RS Components and Farnell served the professional and semi-professional market. CPC Farnell and a handful of smaller online specialists served the hobbyist. But none of them were on the high street. None of them could be walked into on a Saturday morning with a half-formed problem and a willingness to be pointed in the right direction. The broader lesson that Maplin's collapse offered to British retail was not, in truth, a new one. It was the same lesson that Woolworths had offered in 2008, that BHS had offered in 2016, that Toys R Us UK had offered in 2018. A viable business, carrying a brand with genuine customer loyalty and a clear market position, can be made unviable by the application of sufficient debt and the extraction of sufficient capital. The mechanism is not complicated. The consequences are entirely predictable. And yet the mechanism continues to be applied because the people who apply it bear none of the consequences and capture most of the returns. Maplin was not killed by Amazon alone, though Amazon accelerated its decline. It was not killed by Brexit alone, though Brexit removed the financial buffer that might have allowed it to survive long enough to adapt. It was killed by the combination of strategic drift, the slow abandonment of the specialist identity that had made it irreplaceable, and financial engineering that left it with no capacity to absorb the shocks that a more robust business might have survived. What do we lose when a place like Maplin disappears? Not just the shop, but the idea that a space could exist on the British high street where knowledge was the primary product, where expertise was freely given, where the person asking a technical question could expect a genuinely useful answer? That question does not have a comfortable answer. And the fact that it does not is itself a part of the story. Picture a Saturday morning in 1987. Not a remarkable Saturday, not a birthday, not a holiday, not any kind of occasion that would be written down or remembered for its own sake. An ordinary Saturday in an ordinary British town, in the particular gray bright light of a winter morning when the frost has lifted, but the warmth has not yet arrived. A man parks his car in a retail park. His son, 11, perhaps 12, is beside him. They have a list, 3 items written in pencil on the back of an envelope, torn from a notepad on the kitchen table before breakfast. A specific value resistor, a length of screen cable, a connector that the boy has been trying to source for 3 weeks for a project that has been half finished on his bedroom desk for longer than either of them will admit. They push open the door. The smell arrives first. That particular combination of new plastic, flux residue, in the faint warmth of electronic components that anyone who ever spent time in a place like this will carry somewhere in their memory for the rest of their life. The lighting is bright and even. The shelves are orderly. The drawers are labeled in small, precise type. Behind the counter, a man in his 40s looks up, nods, and returns to the circuit board he is examining. They find the resistor in the 3rd drawer they try. The screened cable is on a reel at the end of the aisle, priced by the meter. The connector takes longer, but a member of staff, when asked, knows exactly where it is without consulting a catalog or a screen. He leads them to it directly, takes it from a small bin on a lower shelf, and holds it up to confirm it is the right one before handing it over. The total comes to less than £2. They drive home. The project is finished by Sunday afternoon. It works. That transaction, £2, 3 components, 1 Saturday morning, was not economically significant by any measure that a private equity firm would recognize. But it was significant in every way that matters, because the boy who finished that project on Sunday afternoon understood, from that point forward, that he was capable of building things, that problems had solutions if you knew where to look for them, that the gap between an idea and a functioning object was bridgeable with the right components and the right advice. That knowledge was something that could be sought, found, and applied, and that there were places in the world and people in the world who would help you do exactly that. Maplin did not build Britain's engineers, but it equipped them. For 46 years, it was the place where the instinct to understand and make and repair could be acted upon, concretely, affordably, and with the support of people who took that instinct seriously. This matters beyond sentiment. Britain's capacity to design, build, and maintain complex systems, the capacity that built its railways, its radar networks, its manufacturing base, its contribution to the technologies that shaped the 20th century, did not emerge from nowhere. It was cultivated generation by generation in exactly the kinds of environments that Maplin represented. Garages and garden sheds and school workshops, and for 4 decades, the Saturday morning ritual of a shop that believed its customers were capable of more than they had yet attempted. When that shop closed, the components it sold did not become unavailable. They can still be ordered online, delivered in 2 days, priced competitively. The technical knowledge that its staff embodied has not vanished from the world. It exists in forums and YouTube channels and maker communities, and the accumulated expertise of everyone who ever worked there or learned there. But the physical space is gone, the place where you could walk in without knowing exactly what you needed and walk out with it, and with a conversation that left you better equipped to tackle the problem than when you arrived. That place is gone, and in its absence, something has become slightly harder to begin. The first project, the first repair, the moment when curiosity becomes capability, that is not nothing. That is, in fact, quite a lot. Somewhere in Britain tonight, a man is clearing out his garage. He is in his 60s, perhaps. He has lived in the same house for 30 years. At the back of a shelf, behind paint tins and extension leads and a toolbox that belonged to his father, he finds a paper bag, small, slightly yellowed at the edges, stapled shut. The Maplin logo is printed on the side in the typeface he has known since he was a teenager. He does not open it. He already knows what is inside. A handful of components bought for a project that was never finished, set aside one Saturday afternoon with the intention of returning to it and never returned to. He does not throw the bag away. He puts it back on the shelf because it is not rubbish. It is evidence. Evidence that a place existed where this kind of thing was possible, where a Saturday morning could be spent in the company of people who understood what you were trying to do and helped you do it, where knowledge was the currency and nobody was made to feel that their question was too small or their project too obscure or their curiosity too inconvenient. That place is gone. The bag remains. It is enough for now to know that it was real.